Hello and thanks for joining me. Let's chat for a few minutes about Cold Mountain by Charles Frazier. This is the most recent book that I reread in my December month of rereading. And following this chat, I will also touch base briefly on what I'm currently reading, as well as do a drawing for the first book of 2018 that I will be reading off of my must-read priority list. I have all of the actual physical books bought already, offered for that list, and then I do have samples of all the electronic versions, so I will be ready to discuss whichever drawing comes up in the randomness of the universe, so we'll do that at the end of this chat. But back to Cold Mountain. So this book was originally published in 1997, 20 years ago this year, and I read this I think in 1997 or very early in 1998. I believe I actually read it in the year that it came out, so 20 years ago. And then after I finished it back then, I let it simmer for a little bit, and then I picked it up and I read it again. But nevertheless, the last time I read this book was 19 or 20 years ago. This book did end up winning the National Book Award for Fiction in 1997. So I loved the book back then, and I was real curious. I remembered the book came up in a tag, the History Trail tag that I did earlier this year. One of the questions was about historical fiction set in your country or your culture, and this is the one that I talked about because it takes place in it's a Civil War era novel. It takes place in the Civil War, during the Civil War in North Carolina, and I'm originally from Arkansas, so Southern culture was sort of the connection with that tag. But yeah, what it's about, like I said, it's set in the Civil War era. We start out with a soldier, Inman, who is in the war, fighting in the war. He has been in the war already for some years, and he has been injured in Virginia pretty bad at the Battle of Petersburg in Virginia, and he's sent to, I gather, Raleigh, North Carolina, the capital of North Carolina, where he's from, to heal. He's actually not expected to live, so they don't intervene very much with his wounds, but he does slowly start to heal, and then he's very sick of the war, you know. He's been in the war a long time, and he's seen a lot of horrible things, and he writes this letter sort of at the very beginning of the book. I just thought I would read it because it sort of sets the premise for the entire book, and it says, the letter says, "I am coming home one way or another, and I do not know how things might stand between us. I first thought to tell in this letter what I have done and seen, so that you might judge me before I return. But I decided it would need a page as broad as the blue sky to write that tale, and I have not the will or the energy. Do you recall that night before Christmas 4 years ago, when I took you in my lap in the kitchen by the stove, and you told me you would forever like to sit there and rest your head on my shoulder? Now it is a bitter surety in my heart that if you knew what I have seen and done, it would make you fear to do such again." Who he's writing to there is Ada, this young woman that he knew shortly before the war. They didn't know each other all that well, but they did sort of have a spark together, and he writes this letter to her. And then he sets out, basically he's deserting. And so he starts making this long journey home to Cold Mountain, which is the area of far western North Carolina where he is from. So he sets out on foot. Now this is a very dangerous journey because this is the Civil War era, and so deserters, there's a group called the Home Guard that search out deserters and either kill them on the spot, they take them in to be hung, or they get returned to, to the military. So he spends a lot of time trying to avoid the Home Guard. But meanwhile, Ada, the person to whom he wrote this letter, she had been the daughter of a minister from Charleston. So she had grown up in this urbane culture, and then she and her father, for his health, had moved to far western North Carolina. And then as the war had proceeded, he actually died, and she was sort of left on this farm in western North Carolina with no idea how to run it, and she's basically starving. And so the chapters of this book alternate between Inman's journey home, the soldier's journey walking home, and then Ada's journey, or Ada at the farm. She is eventually joined by another character called Ruby, who is sort of this very dirt poor woman who, she's not exactly homeless, but she's really scraping by subsistence kind of existence, and she hears, Ruby overhears from a neighbor person that Ada is in need of some help, and so she goes really to help her there, and really, you know, doesn't want to be a servant, and makes that very clear that she's not there to be a servant, but they are there to work together to bring, you know, to sort of survive. And so they strike up a friendship, and they proceed to sort of get the farm going back to where it can support them. And so that's sort of the journey that we're on. You know, the thing about Inman's journey home is so cool, is so interesting, that the characters that he meets, you know, it's almost like the Odyssey, where he runs across these extremely cool, that granted there's a lot of time, there's a lot of danger as well, but really interesting, almost mythological type characters that he comes across, both human and animal. So that part's really cool. And then this journey that Ada and Ruby go on, Ada's journey into becoming another person. You know, I think this is an overarching theme of the whole novel, really, is that the Civil War is this outside force that the characters are powerless to, you know, they find themselves caught up in history. They in the time that they're living. They find themselves caught up in the time they're living, which we all do, right? We are all products of when we're living, and that comes with its own challenges. But what's happened in their case is, a war occurring really there, and Inman finding he's forced to participate in that as a young man, and then Ada is basically ruined financially in the war. She can't go anywhere, so she's kind of stuck where she is too. And then Ruby is this third character that, to me, she sort of represented an elemental force, an elemental spirit, because she's very grounded in reality and very grounded in practicality and very earth-centered. So, you know, the balance of these three characters was just so well done. And then Ruby's dad, Ruby's father, he's also sort of this elemental spirit, although he's not an earth spirit tied to a place. He's more like an elemental spirit of air. And so he had neglected Ruby. She had been left, there was no mother. The mother had died in childbirth, and Ruby had sort of been left to fend for herself because her father has no ties to anything. He's sort of this elemental spirit of air, a fiddler, but kind of a rover and, just not tied to anything. But this balance between really these four characters is just so beautifully done. This book has just got such a fantastic atmosphere of the time and the place. And it even feels chilly. The book starts out in the summer and then proceeds on through the winter. And, by the time we get to the winter, cold mountain, it's definitely, I could just feel the atmosphere. And then this whole nostalgia of things past, and it really illustrates the impermanence of everything. How something like the war could come along and sweep everything away and change everything. But this is sort of a recurring theme, I think, through the novel, and the author uses things like allusions to passenger pigeons, which used to be numbered in the millions, and then were extinct by the end of the 19th century, as well as American chestnut trees, which also, I don't think they've quite gone completely extinct, but there was some kind of blight at the beginning of the 20th century that wiped out almost all of the American chestnut trees. And then the artifact, the Native Americans, they come across Native American art and Native American things the Native American people had left behind, as well as little Native American, even a little Native American village at one point, because of course all the Native Americans in western North Carolina were forcibly removed by the U.S. government, by Andrew Jackson and the U.S. government on the Trail of Tears, and so they were no more. And Inman, the soldier, ponders this at some point, that they're gone, that they probably never realized that their world was about to so utterly come to an end as it did for them. And so the book is just such a beautiful meditation on the impermanence, I think, that I just loved it. I was not sure, reading it again after so long, I was real curious, you know, if it was going to affect me the same way, and I definitely still really loved it. And it's different now that I've read it. Now this is the third time over the course of 20 years. I think I can safely say that this is probably one of my favorite works of fiction, you know, ever, because I could probably read this again in the relatively in the next couple of years. I could probably read it again and enjoy it again, you know, just because I think it's just so beautifully done, and it's just this beautiful story of Inman. You know, this was adapted into a movie starring Jude Law as Inman and Nicole Kidman as Ada, and Renee Zellweger played Ruby. And I think that the movie was a little bit different because I think in the movie it was just a little different. I won't go into it because I don't want to give too much away. But the book, I think one of the cool things, really the cool things in the book is that Inman doesn't even really it's not, he does focus on her going back to Cold Mountain, but really he wants to go back to Cold Mountain regardless. So he has this real sense of place. And Ada starts out the novel not having a sense of place because she's originally from Charleston, and so she's not from the Cold Mountain, Western North Carolina. But you know what her journey is to find place in a turbulent world is also a fantastic story. And then the whole Ruby and her dad, Stobard, I think his name is Stobard. They're sort of elemental, I think, forces that interplay with the two other main characters. It's just so balanced, and I just enjoyed it so much. So I think I'll end the chat with that. And what I am currently reading is The Liberation of Life by Charles Birch and John Cobb. This came out in 1981, and I read this in college. I think I read this in 1982 or 1983. I think it was 1982, so it's been a really long time. This was a book that really was pivotal to me in college. It changed my views on many, many, many things in many directions, and so I was real curious to read this again. This is another one. I'll explain more when I do the chat about why I decided to reread it at this point, but yeah, so far I'm about a third of the way through, and so far I'm really enjoying this. So I'm really glad that I gave this a reread. This is actually going to be the last book that I'm going to get a chance to reread for 2017. It'll be the last book that I read in 2017, and then I will start my 2018 must-read priority list, which, speaking of that, let's figure out what the first one's going to be. Oh, I had two pop out, so I'm just going to pick one of those to see what the first read of the year is going to be. Disarmed, the story of the Venus de Milo. Okay, great. So Disarmed is about the Venus de Milo, you know, the famous sculptor. You know what? This doesn't have a very pretty cover because this is a vintage ebook, and vintage ebooks never put their covers in their ebooks. They're on the thumb only, but not the actual when you open the book, which I find annoying, but you know. Anyway, there it is. This is by Gregory Curtis. It's about the Venus de Milo and its discovery in the early 19th century, and then its journey to become, you know, one of the grand treasures of world heritage that it is today. So it falls into my theme of music and art, and so that will be my first read off of my 2018 priority list, which will be coming up following The Liberation of Life. So a lot coming up in 2018. Take care. Bye.